be helping people mobilize and create a vehicle to represent a different kind of political field that right now we won't see unless we change our narratives, unless we change the stories we tell on radio. And I'm sorry, I can't give us a pass on this because we have not been doing our job as independent media in this country. And I think that's the challenge for all of us, to do more and to be more critical of how we cover the news, how we hide behind this objective mask.
Question, please.
My name is Caroline. I have a question for you specifically, Sylvia, about, well, I was really intrigued by your comment about like how commercial media like to separate people in separate markets, right? And then sort of like a lot of what independent media is about, or about what real public media is about, is how we change our relationships to each other, right? Whether we see each other as siblings or as strangers. And like I have a question which may be a bit too big, but like I just wonder, like from a person, a lay person who isn't necessarily part of independent media. Well, like I have friends who are part of co-op radio. Well, that's not what I'm not part of their statement. Yeah, like how can we talk about our counter narratives when so much of the language is divisive? Like something very specific that I see ongoing is this very divisive language against immigrants and refugees, right? And one thing that I've been trying to help out is with Hussein Figueroa. I'm not sure if you've read about his story. Well, like I there's so many like stories about refugees and like unjust deportations in media and stuff. But like when you don't know these people, it's very easy to be like, oh, well, that's too bad, and put the paper away. But like I just wonder, like, how do you bridge that gap between like the reader and then like the person that the story is about, when so much of the language is othering that person, right? But like how I got to volunteer for his campaign was that I saw him in person at an event at UBC with my professor and stuff, and I immediately saw my link to him, because even though I did not come here as a refugee, he came here as a refugee from El Salvador because he was a student organizer from the FMLN, and but like he's been here 15 years, I've been in Canada for 16 years, and yet somehow my citizenship is cemented, and I have this privilege of like I'm not being questioned, whereas he's here only a year less than me, and yet his family is under the threat of deportation because he used to be student organizer for the FMLN. So like, how do I try to reach out to other people on like changing this language? There's no such thing as illegal refugees. Like there are refugee conventions, right? And all this other thing, but so much of the media is framing refugees and immigrants as others.
I do know Jose. We spoke on my radio show. We did an interview.
I watched
back. But we hadn't met in person, so thank you. It's nice to meet you. I think we change the world by changing how we carry ourselves, by changing how we see. Each and every one of us is a microcosm of change, whether we take that responsibility and honor it or not. And within each of us, there is worlds of possibilities. And so it's how we take this responsibility, which to me is the ability to respond. It's not a should anyone, I don't should anyone. I think that everybody acts according to their capacities, to their limitations. But it is an invitation to realize that when we accept settler colonialism, which is what we are facing here, right? We construct our identities in reflection of others, right? In contour to others. You know, I am Sylvia because I am not Jean, or you know, and there's always this constant. Instead, I think if we start to reclaim that language and reimagine what's the impact of this language, who benefits from creating immigrants and refugees, who is benefiting from this language, right? Now we know that settler population have dismissed the relationship that the state has with indigenous people and their ownership of the lands that are occupied. We know that when we have settlements displace other people, we're effectively changing the narrative that will describe that place. We call this British Columbia. for the coastalish people, it could be Musqueam territory, it could be Timbuktu. It depends on who the people we're trespassing on, but we no longer name those people. So to have this idea of borders becomes a very convenient political tool to use to divide and fragment people. So when we're thinking in terms of narratives of immigrant other, citizen other, indigenous other, Canadian white person, whatever we decided is Canadian, right? The Canadian has a valorized identity that we all sort of acknowledge without speaking to it. And so it begins with us recognizing those things within ourselves. How do we perform those scripts of colonization? How do we perform and continuously replicate and reproduce and maintain those kinds of structures? So it takes each of us taking notice of a case like Jose's. It takes each of us taking notice of the distancing between nature and development, the distancing between a mining company's right to expand their financial hold, or whatever when they call it, and the rights of people to have access to clean water, and the rights of people to have access to their ancestral territory, and the rights of people to see each other, to have a culture that has sustained them. What do we lose is what we need to ask each of ourselves when we are blind to the struggles of others. What do we lose when we miss these opportunities? And the answer to me is we lose a lot of things. On the insignificant, perhaps superficial level, we lose the opportunity to see a diversity view of the world, and another perspective that could open us to new ways of being. On a more fundamental way, we lose the opportunity to experience justice, to contribute and create a world that is just, a world that's not organized around rights, and by rights we normally mean property rights. We're not talking about the rights of people, we're not talking about the rights of nature, we're talking about property rights, and that's what borders really define, is who has the right to own, who has the right to be seen, to be visible, and who's invisible, and who by their invisibility becomes the immigrant other, the settler other, that can be exploited, that can be mistreated, that can be displaced, that can be abused, that can be incarcerated, and you can go on with the list. So it begins doing by what you're doing exactly. Taking notice of who we are, holding hands with others and saying, you know what, I'm going to stand with you, and this is perhaps a little uncomfortable for some of us to do. But this is what we need to do. We need to realize we're connected, we're interconnected, and our struggles are interconnected. Our stories are interconnected and interwoven in beautiful ways. And we can rediscover ourselves in the struggles we join, the struggles we participate in, and the way we organize politically. You seem like someone who's been always at the forefront and creating. And I love your question, because it is about creating possibility. It's about mobilizing ourselves politically. It's about reimagining a culture that's not stagnant, that's not rigid, that's not frozen or fixed in place. But the culture is what we make, what we do every day, and how we carry ourselves.
I also just want to add, were you at the talk last night at Woodward's?
No, I wasn't.
Okay, I actually wasn't either, but I got to get a recap from some of my colleagues. But the talk last night was by Dr. Sanara Tabani, who's a women's studies professor out at UBC, and it was a talk about a film called Words of Witness, which is about images of women in the Middle East and women's struggles in the Middle East in this new sort of democratic experimentation age. And I think she brought up a point which a number of people have brought back to me, is that even within alternative media, because, and I think what you mentioned is that because we grow up surrounded by media that isn't sensitive to colonial issues or settler colonial issues, when we go to produce our own media in a public sense or a collaborative sense, we do still hold the script in our head that's colonial. So Dr. Tabani last night was talking about the ways that a lot of independent and ostensibly public